Back, boxing fans, to another lunchtime walk. So obviously pound for pound lists change. This is something that I've tried to preach on my channel for years now, but for some hard-headed people this concept is unfortunately very difficult for them to understand, so much so that they put out huge energy to hate on anyone that somehow was elevated into the number one position over a fighter they may have cheered for. Yet it's all about preference, but only when it's related to their preference. Their preference is right, everybody's preference is wrong. We know that obviously pound for pound is a subjective list. We try to put criteria to make it as sensible as you can by talking about weight classes won, titles won, world champions beaten, title defenses. These kind of things are really the only thing you can really use to gauge how efficient and how effective somebody is. So obviously this is usually an important part to trying to figure out how you make a pound for pound list. Some people prefer to use the eye test, which basically just tells you it's a very subjective list because it's all based on their eye, right? Not with criteria that anybody can actually look at and use to evaluate a fighter. And unfortunately, we've noticed this more and more over the years when people try to justify their pound for pound list more than in the past. Obviously this weekend we had 2 pound for pound fighters that actually fought. We also have another pound for pound fighter who's fighting this upcoming weekend. We recently just had a pound for pound fighter get beat. And you know, obviously there's other criteria that have to be thought with regards to that, because if Ryan Garcia did cheat, then obviously that fight should be a no contest. And then obviously that is no longer a loss on Devin Haney's resume. But at the same time, well, it's not a loss. It's still not the biggest statement as a pound for pound fighter getting dropped multiple times by the same punch. So that's obviously something that people have to think about as well, and definitely changes the outcome and positions on a pound for pound list. We also have an upcoming young fighter making a huge statement fight soon, and as I mentioned, an old pound for pound fighter trying to put himself back into the conversation. Actually 2. So let's break this down. Let's take a look at it. Obviously my list is not your list. Everybody's going to be able to talk about why they have some people on a list over other people. It just is what it is. We saw some people actually put Ryan Garcia on their pound for pound list after his victory over Devin Haney. Not me, but several people did that, which, you know, is one of the main reasons why you need to look at a person's resume and accolades more than just a one-off fight. If you're going to use a one-off fight as a way to justify a guy on a pound for pound list, eventually that's going to be exposed, right? We saw that obviously with regards to Ryan Garcia. We saw it with George Kambosos, and we've seen it with many other fighters who ended up getting career victories, but then sooner or later were exposed as not really pound for pound quality fighters. So currently the big debate is between who is the number one pound for pound fighter. And there's different things you need to think about when you talk about a pound for pound list. Activity is important. You can't use somebody's history as the only thing that justifies them being number one on the list, even though some people like to do that. And it's ironic that many people have hated on certain people's resumes. So if you use that as the justification for putting a person number one, you yourself have actually disqualified him by criticizing his resume over the past. And being inactive, not taking all the great fights available, may actually have more to do with political preference, you know, between promotional teams. And that's unfortunate. It is what it is, and that has to be thought about as well. Sometimes you don't get the fight you need, the fight you want, and it has nothing to do with you. It's obviously not in your hands. But obviously what we're talking about right now is the current debate going on between Bud Crawford and Inouye as the pound for pound number one fighter. And in all reality, If you pick either one of these guys as your pound for pound number one fighter, you can't go wrong. They are two of the best pound for pound fighters in the sport of boxing. They're the only two fighters that currently are undisputed in two weight divisions, something that before they did it looked as if it was never going to be done ever. So hats off to both Bud and to Inui for accomplishing something and breaking that glass ceiling, so to speak. Obviously, we got American fans who are prone to put Bud Crawford number one on the pound for pound list, mostly because he represents them. A lot of other people that are not American centric would want maybe Inui as their pound for pound number one fighter, especially since he's won titles in more weight divisions, has equaled what Bud Crawford has done as far as becoming a two-weight undisputed champion, and has far more world title fights with a far higher win percentage and KO percentage, which are both very exciting. 22 world title fights, 20 of them were won by KO. That's impressive. You also have to look at activity. One fighter is fighting 2 or 3 times a year. Another fighter is fighting once a year. That's another thing that needs to be addressed. And I'm not saying you shouldn't have Bud Crawford in your pound for pound list. Bud Crawford currently is pound for pound number one on my list. But I'm not going to hate on anyone that has Inui on their list at number one for good reason. Inui deserves the accolades he's getting because of what he's done. Obviously, haters are going to try to talk about his resume not being good, but these are the same things that Errol Spence fans said about Bud Crawford's resume. So to now turn the tide and try to do the exact same thing that Spence fans did to dismiss and downplay Crawford is just the same. It's deplorable, and it's not what boxing fans should be doing. Ignorance is not an excuse. The fact that you don't know who Inui fought has more to do with you as a casual boxing fan than it has to do with Inui and his greatness. Another person that needs to be in this conversation and is going to be fighting 2 weeks from now is Alexander Usyk. And many people right now are making a case for him being pound for pound number one, because if he beats Tyson Fury to equal both Inui and Bud Crawford by becoming a two-weight undisputed champion, which is super impressive. But what's more impressive is he's fighting a guy who is 40 to 50 pounds bigger than him on fight night. Something that obviously Inui and Crawford, no matter how many weight divisions they've went through, have never had to deal with such deficiency against them. And this is something Usyk is going to have to deal with, and it's a big hurdle to get over. And if for some reason or some way or somehow he is able to beat Tyson Fury and become the first undisputed champion in heavyweight division since Lennox Lewis, he definitely is going to be in the conversation as well as pound for pound number one. And that's why I talk about this historically, when we had guys like Ward, Roman Gonzalez, Lomachenko, Bud Crawford, and other people being discussed as pound for pound number one. Two things can be true. You can have 3 or 4 fighters that really are qualified to be pound for pound number one, and the difference between them is subjective and very limited, slim margins. So I always stated that there is no Floyd Mayweather. There's no dominant guy who is leaps and bounds above the competition, so that there's no way that we could ever think about someone else being in the number one position. And now this is exactly the same when we talk about Bud Crawford, Inui, and Usyk. By trying to hype up Crawford just because he's a black American fighter, to dismiss both Inui, an Asian, and Usyk, a white European, is just a racist narrative showing your bias and double standard. The reality is these guys have put themselves in this conversation, unlike fighters like a Devin Haney or a Tank Davis or other fighters like potentially Canelo Alvarez, who at this time just aren't at the same level these 3 fighters are on. And you may favor one fighter over the other, and that's fine. You can have your preference. But why are you arguing against somebody else's preference? That's the bigger conversation point here. Obviously, if Usyk becomes an undisputed 2-weight champion, equaling Inui and Crawford, what a group of fighters at the top of boxing. And it's easy conversation to talk about how those three fighters are number 1, 2, and 3, regardless of what position you may put them in. After those three fighters, now the conversation becomes a little more complicated. We did think that potentially the 4th or 5th best fighter in the division or in the pound for pound list would be a combination of Canelo and Bivol and Beterbiev. We were hoping to see Canelo face David Benavidez. If he beat David Benavidez, that would be a huge accolade to put him and solidify him as the number 4 or number 5 fighter on the pound for pound list. Obviously, he had a very successful fight against Jaime Munguia just last weekend, and it was a very solid performance showing the levels to this sport. And as far as Beterbiev Bivol, that was a fight people have been asking for a few years now, and was my most anticipated fight of 2024. Unfortunately, because of another Beterbiev injury, this fight probably is never going to happen, and that is definitely disappointing. I think Beterbiev should be put on champion in recess and allow this division to move forward until he is healthy and willing and able to jump in and take on Bivol for undisputed. But we'll see what happens. Right now for Bivol, taking on the next opponent he has is just a stay busy fight. It's not a fight that's going to prove anything, and it's not going to raise him up or take him down, well, unless he loses, him on a pound for pound list. What he needs is a quality opponent, a fighter like Beterbiev, and him becoming undisputed to justify himself in the top 5. Outside of those guys, then we get a whole group of fighters who show a lot of promise, a lot of ability, and have accomplished a lot in the sport. When we're talking about guys like Shakur Stevenson, a 3-weight world champion, Devin Haney, undisputed, currently a 2-weight world champion, Bam Rodriguez, who's going to be taking on a pound for pound quality fighter in Juan Francisco Estrada, probably one of the best opponents anybody is facing in 2024. If he's able to do to Estrada what he's done to all the other top fighters he faced, he definitely is going to elevate himself right up that pound for pound list in a big way. Deservedly so, and justifiably so. You have obviously Ioka, who's currently a 4-weight world champion, who's going to be fighting the tough Argentinian in a unification fight this year. Hopefully the winner of that fight can take on the winner of Bam and Estrada, which would be fucking excellent for the 115-pound division. Of course, American-centric YouTubers, they won't talk about any of those fights. They won't give attention to any of the winners. They won't even build up a potential unification fight that could justify one of these winners being highly ranked on the pound for pound list. Because the last thing they want to do is give anybody any shine. Even though these guys potentially are doing what many American fighters aren't doing. Fighting for unification, fighting the top competition in and around their weight class. Then you think about guys like Junto Nakatani. Junto Nakatani, who just might be the monster slayer. I wanted to see him face Bam Rodriguez. Unfortunately, that fight never really happened. And now he's in his 3rd weight division as a 3-weight world champion with a devastating victory at bantamweight. And now what we hope to see him do is take on unification fights at 118. Hopefully, that may mean Monster's brother, Anui, for his WBA title and Junto for his WBC title, which would be great. A huge fight, which would get tons of attention in Japan. If Junto was able to destroy Anui's brother, like he has so many other opponents that he's fought, then a big clash between both of them seems as if it's a definitive possibility and a great fight. Probably the biggest fight in Japan ever, and a fight that I would get super excited about seeing happen. So I do hope Anui doesn't leave 122. I hope he does stay there for a while longer, so that the possibility of having a great fight like that increases. So right now, you can see by the fighters we're talking about, fighters who are literally accomplished, fighters that are multiple weight world champions, fighters that are fighting in unification fights, fighters that are fighting the best competition in and around their weight division. What else would you want a pound for pound fighter to do outside of that? People love Tank Davis, and don't get me wrong, I think he's one of the most exciting fighters in boxing. I'm excited to see him get in there with Frank Martin. More the merrier. I'd prefer to see him fight 3 times a year as opposed to be under house arrest and going back and forth with Carissa Shields. But the thing we need Tank to do is prove that he's interested in making the biggest fights available, like the fighters I've just mentioned in this video. Is he interested in taking on Devin Haney, Teo Lopez, Shakur, Lomachenko? Is he interested in fighting the best opponents available in a unification fight? This is a guy who's 30 years old, is now a 2-weight world champion, and has never had a unification fight. And people dismiss this and ignore it. Knockout Boxing, his biggest fan, he won't address that. He will blame it on everybody else, even though we know that he went out of his way to duck and dodge multiple unification fights. He talked about not being interested in fighting for titles, but fighting for money. So he shows you that legacy is not that important to him. Of course, now he just signed a 6-fight deal with the PBC. But who does the PBC have currently at 135 and 140 pounds that could make big, exciting fights for Tank Davis on pay-per-view? Why aren't people giving Tank Davis a hard time for re-signing with the PBC and not signing with top-ranked Bob Arum, who has all the other champions? Whether we're talking about 135 pounds or 130 pounds. When we get to 140, why didn't he sign with Eddie Hearn and DAZN, who's in conjunction with Saudi Arabia and has most of the titles currently at 140 pounds? PBC literally has one champion at 140 pounds, and that's a fight we've already seen, Tank Davis versus Isaac Cruz. Well, it's not a bad fight, and it's probably a more intriguing fight now than it was when it was originally scheduled. It's still not the fight boxing fans are asking for. But don't get me wrong, if Tank Davis chooses to move up to his 3rd weight division and fight a champion for a legitimate world title to become a 3-weight world champion, I will definitely give him tons of credit for doing that. But the fights we're asking for are no different than people trying to hold David Benavidez as the only opponent that Canelo can fight. Tank Davis is in a similar position. Why isn't he going to fight Shakur Stevenson? Shakur, in an interview just brought up recently, is he going to be guaranteed a Tank Davis fight if he signs with the PBC? Right? There are no guarantees in this sport. We know that. I saw Knockout saying, well, make sure his name is written into the contract. Well, it's interesting that when we talk about Canelo Alvarez and David Benavidez, that's not highlighted there. Why didn't David Benavidez make sure that Canelo was part of his contract when he signed a 3-fight deal? Why didn't Al Heyman make sure that David Benavidez was part of Canelo Alvarez's 3-fight deal with the PBC? Let's just be fair and honest and break the sport down, not by the color of people's skin, not by the countries that they reside in, but based on actually what they're doing in the ring and who they're fighting. Because at the end of the day, that's the only thing that matters. It's the only thing people can evaluate and judge fairly. So leave your comments below. Let me know who your top 5 pound for pound fighters are. Do you have Usyk, Inoue, and Crawford in your top 3? If not, why the fuck not? And if you do, what position do you have them currently listed? Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. It's coffee time. Peace out, everyone. Have a good one.